person quietly, invisibly, tucked behind the smiles and the standing ovations and the sold-out concert halls. For more than 6 decades, Cliff Richard stood at the center of British pop culture, adored, celebrated, and utterly unknowable. He was the boy from nowhere who became a legend. But the story the public was given was never the whole. There is a particular kind of loneliness that fame cannot fix. It wraps itself around a Tory. Behind the gleaming image, behind the bachelor reputation and the Christian values and the endless reinvention, was a man carrying weight that the spotlight never illuminated. This is the account of a double life, not in the scandalous tabloid sense the world expected, but in a far more profound and human sense. A man who performed openness while living in careful concealment. A man who gave everything to the public and kept the most essential parts of himself locked away. And the truths now emerging are not salacious. They are simply sad and real and long overdue. He was not born Cliff Richard. He was Harry Roger Webb, born on the 14th of October 1940 in Lucknow, then part of British India. His father, Roger Oscar Webb, worked in catering management for the Indian Railways. His mother, Dorothy Marie, came from a hard-working Anglo-Indian family that understood what it meant to survive on determination rather than privilege. The world Harry Webb entered was already unstable. The violence of partition and the upheaval of Direct Action Day shook the subcontinent and pushed thousands of Anglo-Indian families to reconsider where they belonged. The Webbs were among them. They made the decision to leave India and start again in Britain, carrying almost nothing with them except the belief that a new country could offer their children a better future. The England they arrived in was grey, post-war, and indifferent to their particular background. The family settled into modest circumstances, and Harry grew up keenly aware of the gap between where he was and where he wished to be. But something stirred in him young. Music. Specifically skiffle. That loose, joyful do-it-yourself sound that was spreading through British youth culture in the 1950s. When Harry was 16, his father made a gesture that would quietly redirect the course of history. He bought his son a guitar. It was a simple act of parental faith, the kind that most fathers make without understanding the magnitude of what they are doing. Roger Webb could not have known he was setting a future pop icon in motion. What he gave his son was not just an instrument. He gave him a direction. In 1957, Harry formed a school vocal group called the Quintons, then joined the Dick Teague skiffle group. The transformation from Harry Webb to Cliff Richard followed soon after, a stage name constructed to sound exciting, American, modern. He was reinventing himself before he had even properly invented himself. That instinct, to present one version of the self while keeping another private, would define him for the rest of his life. His father died before he could see where it all led. Cliff has spoken about this loss with a particular quality of grief, not the sharp grief of sudden shock, but the slow, bruising grief of a wound that never properly closes. He gave me my start, Cliff once reflected, and then he was gone before he could see where it led. The death embedded a kind of grief-shaped silence at the core of who Cliff was. With his father gone, he became a provider. For his mother, for his 3 younger sisters, for the entire family's stability. There was no space to fall apart. There was no room for weakness. He held himself together, and that holding became habitual. It became his default. Smile, perform, provide, endure. In 1958, a teenage Cliff walked into a studio and recorded a song called Move It. The session took less than half an hour. The result was raw, physical, and utterly unlike anything Britain had produced. A genuine rock and roll record that could stand beside anything coming out of America. Overnight, Cliff Richard became the UK's answer to Elvis Presley. The girls screamed. The newspapers exploded. The machinery of fame swallowed him whole. What followed was one of the most sustained careers in the history of popular music. By the early 1960s, Cliff Richard and the Shadows were an unstoppable force. Living Doll. The Young Ones. Summer Holiday. These were not merely chart records. They were cultural events, anthems for a generation finding its footing in post-war prosperity. He starred in films, headlined tours, received mountains of fan mail from every corner of the country. From the outside, it looked like everything anyone could dream of. But perfection, as always, was performing something it was not. The pace was relentless. While friends from his childhood were settling into marriages and mortgages and school runs, Cliff was living out of tour buses, hotel rooms, and recording studios. The ordinary rhythms of life, the quiet Sunday afternoons, the slow accumulation of shared history with another person, were simply not available to him. Fame occupied every hour. And in occupying every hour, it quietly foreclosed certain futures. Then, in 1964, Cliff did something that genuinely shocked the industry. At the height of his success, at just 24 years old, he became a born-again Christian. In an era when pop stars were expected to lean into rebellion, when the counterculture was gathering itself for a decade of excess, Cliff chose faith. He began reconsidering his lyrics, declining certain performances, and at one point seriously contemplated abandoning music altogether to become a teacher or missionary. The industry assumed he had effectively ended his own career. He hadn't. But the decision set him apart in ways that would ripple through every subsequent decade. He wasn't part of the wild party culture. He wasn't chasing tabloid headlines. He lived differently. And that difference built another wall between him and what most people would recognize as an ordinary life.
When Cliff Richard released Bachelor Boy in the early 1960s, it was intended as a light-hearted pop song, a cheerful, winking celebration of youthful freedom before presumed inevitability of marriage. Nobody read anything particular into it at the time. It was catchy, fun, and utterly of its moment. But as the years passed and Cliff remained unmarried, the song transformed. What had been a lyric became a label. What had been a joke became a question that followed him everywhere he went. Why didn't he ever marry? Interviewers asked it. Journalists speculated. The public turned it into a parlor game. Cliff, for his part, never gave a simple answer, because there was never a simple answer to give. In his autobiography, My Life, My Way, he wrote with characteristic thoughtfulness about this question. He acknowledged deep love in his life. He acknowledged meaningful relationships. But he also acknowledged honestly that the career he had chosen, the constant touring, the relentless public attention, the total absence of ordinary privacy, would have made sustaining a marriage extraordinarily difficult. He was not being evasive. He was being accurate. The most publicized romantic relationship of his life was with former tennis champion Sue Barker in the 1980s. The media treated it like a royal romance, breathlessly tracking their every public appearance. Cliff later revealed that he had seriously considered proposing. In the end, he stepped back. He realized, with uncomfortable clarity, that he did not feel strongly enough to make that lifelong commitment. To his credit, he framed this honestly. It wouldn't have been fair to either of them, and that honesty, while admirable, only deepened the mystery. If not her, then who? If not then when? Through much of that time, one steady presence remained in his life. His close friend and former manager, Bill Latham. For over 30 years, they shared a home in Sunningdale, along with Bill's mother and later, Cliff's own mother during her illness with Alzheimer's disease. Their bond sparked endless speculation. Cliff consistently described Bill's family like a brother, the person who knew him beyond performance, beyond the spotlight. When Bill passed away in 2022, the loss was enormous. Cliff, who rarely shows public vulnerability, did not hide at this time. They had shared decades of life. The successes, the setbacks, the ordinary Tuesday evenings that accumulate into a shared existence. Without Bill, his inner circle contracted sharply. The phrase double life carries implications of deception, of a person hiding something shameful, living two contradictory existences in secret. But Cliff Richard's double life was more subtle than that, and in some ways more tragic. It was a life of a man who had learned, from a very early age, to separate what he felt from what he showed, to perform happiness, to perform certainty, to perform the clean-cut image that the public had decided he embodied, even when the private reality was far messier, far lonelier, far more uncertain. For decades, he gave interviews in which he spoke about his faith, his fitness routine, his music, his gratitude. He projected an image of a man entirely at peace with his choices. And perhaps, in certain moments, he was But the cracks were always there, visible to anyone who looked carefully enough. The way he spoke about his father, with a grief so quietly managed it was almost unbearable. The way he navigated questions about marriage, not with deflection, but with a particular kind of resigned thoughtfulness that spoke of genuine complexity. The way he described living alone, not as freedom, but as something to be endured. He has since admitted, plainly and without self-pity, that he does not like living alone, that at night he sometimes leaves the lights on just to soften the silence, that his homes in Barbados and Portugal, which look at the outside like paradise, have often felt more like retreats from the world than genuine sanctuaries within it. These are not the confessions of a man at peace. They are the confessions of a man who has spent 60-plus years being one thing in public and something considerably more complicated in private. His mother's decline was another layer of quiet grief he largely absorbed without public acknowledgement. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and for more than a decade, Cliff watched her memory disintegrate. He would visit her, and she would not recognize him. The son who had given her so much pride, whose face was on magazine covers and whose voice filled concert halls, invisible to her, erased by a disease that had no interest in legacy or fame. She passed away in 2007 after years of that particular cruelty. And Cliff kept going. He kept touring, kept recording, kept smiling for cameras, because stopping was not something he knew how to do. In the summer of 2014, Cliff Richard woke up to a nightmare. Police raided his Berkshire home, while news helicopters hovered overhead and television cameras broadcast live footage of officers carrying boxes from his private residence. It looked to the watching nation like a public takedown. Cliff wasn't even there. He was on holiday in Portugal, unaware that his name was being pulled across national headlines in real time. The raid had been triggered by an anonymous allegation of historic sexual abuse. Cliff was never arrested. He was never charged. Eventually, the allegation was proven to be entirely false. But in the modern media ecosystem, the damage did not wait for facts. For nearly 2 years, he lived under a cloud of public suspicion so dense it blocked out almost everything else. He later described the experience using a single, devastating word: contaminated. That was how it felt. Not accused, not suspected, contaminated. As though something toxic had been smeared across his identity that no amount of legal vindication could entirely remove. The stress was physical. He struggled to sleep. He lost weight. He admitted there were moments when the pressure on his chest was so severe that he genuinely feared his heart might give out. The allegation became an obsession. The first thought in the morning, the last thought at night, and the thought that woke him in the dark hours in between. He has described this period as the worst of his life, worse than any professional setback, worse than any personal loss, because it attacked something foundational. It attacked his sense of who he was. When his name was finally cleared, something had permanently changed. The relief was real, but the restoration was incomplete. He feared stepping outside. He caught himself wondering whether strangers were looking at him and silently asking, was it true? That doubt, existing not in his own mind but in the imagined minds of everyone around him, proved impossible to shake entirely. In 2018, he won a landmark lawsuit against the BBC for broadcasting live footage of the police raid on his home. The court awarded damages. The headlines, for once, carried a different tone. But Cliff was direct about what victory meant and did not mean. Once your name has been dragged to the mud, it can never be completely clean again. He was right. He knew it, and that knowledge has lived in him ever since. Speaking before members of the House of Lords in the aftermath, he became visibly emotional. He asked himself aloud, will I ever get over it? And then he answered his own question with a single word. No, because the accusation, proven false, legally repudiated, would always exist online, searchable, permanent, while the person who made it remained anonymous, protected by a system that afforded the accused none of the same mercy. After the scandal, Cliff began spending increasing amounts of time in Barbados, the island he now calls home. From the outside, it appears idyllic, palm trees, ocean light, the kind of beauty that makes the world seem simple. But Cliff has admitted it does not always feel like paradise. At times, he has described it as something closer to exile, as though he had been quietly pushed away from the country he loved. Britain had made him. Britain had celebrated him for 6 decades. And then, in one terrible summer, Britain had done something to him that he could not forgive or forget. Moving away felt less like a choice and more like a wound that needed distance to heal. It has not fully healed. He still works to maintain the image people expect. He watches what he eats. He plays tennis. He keeps himself physically disciplined with an almost urgent consistency. Less, it seems, about pure vitality and more about holding the line against the advance of time. He has admitted that rehearsals take more out of him than they used to, that recovery after performances is slower, that the stamina is still there but costs considerably more. These days, one of his closest companions is John McEllen, a former Catholic missionary who helps manage his properties in Barbados and Portugal. Their friendship is steady and genuine. Still, Cliff has said plainly, "I don't like living alone even now." The loneliness is not dramatic. It is simply there, present and unresolved, the texture of his daily life in a way that decades of fame never prepared him for. At 85, Cliff Richard is still recording, still performing. His current tour carries the boldly optimistic title Can't Stop Me Now, a statement of defiance that, when you listen to him talk about it, contains more uncertainty than the title suggests. "I don't want to be an 85-year-old man trying to be 18, he has said. The awareness is there. The acceptance of limits is there. But so is a compulsion to keep going, because the stage has been his anchor for more than 6 decades. It has given him identity, direction, purpose. Without it, he has admitted, the map of his life would look unfamiliar. So he keeps going, not only out of passion, but perhaps because stopping would mean facing a silence he doesn't know how to fill. He has spoken honestly about radio stations that no longer play his music, because of his age, not with bitterness, but with the flat clarity of someone who has stopped pretending. He knows that unless an older artist is packaged as nostalgia or paired with someone younger and fashionable, the industry tends to behave as though they no longer exist. He is too experienced to be surprised by this, but that doesn't mean it doesn't sting. And when the question of regret arises, when someone asks whether he wishes he had married, had children, built the ordinary life that his extraordinary career made impossible, he retreats to a line he has used more than once. You can't regret something you never had. But those who have watched him say it closely note the pause that follows. A breath, a moment in which something passes across his face that is harder to categorize than contentment. As if even he, in the privacy of that pause, allows himself to wonder. The real story of Cliff Richard's double life is not the story of secrets in the tabloid sense. It is the story of a man who mastered the performance of himself so completely that the performance became the only version the world ever saw.